Welcome now. Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. I should have listened to the old man at the gas station. His weathered face and trembling hands should have been warning enough when he grabbed my arm, begging me not to take my RAV up Black Canyon. But I was too focused on getting the perfect sunset shots for my photography portfolio. The canyon's towering walls of dark schist promised dramatic compositions, and I convinced myself his warnings were just local superstition. Besides, my brand new Winnebago Vista was equipped with everything I needed for a comfortable weekend alone in the wilderness. If only I'd known what those walls were hiding. The drive up was deceptively peaceful. Autumn had painted the scattered trees in brilliant shades of red and gold, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the winding road. I found what seemed to be the perfect camping spot. A wide turnout overlooking the canyon's depths, far from the designated campgrounds and their noisy weekend warriors. The view was even better than I'd hoped. With the Gunnison River gleaming like a silver thread thousands of feet below, I parked the RV, positioning it for the best morning light, and spent the next hour setting up my photography equipment. The first sign that something was wrong came just before sunset. I was adjusting my tripod when I heard what sounded like scratching against the RV's exterior, not the gentle scraping of branches. This was deliberate, methodical, like someone dragging their nails across the metal. When I walked around to investigate, the sound stopped. There were no trees close enough to touch the vehicle, and the wind was barely a whisper. But there, gleaming in the fading light, were 3 parallel lines etched into the paint, too precise to be accidental. I told myself it must have happened during the drive-up, though I couldn't remember any close calls with branches or rocks. The sun was setting fast, and I still needed to get my shots. The canyon walls were transforming into sheets of burning gold, and I lost myself in capturing the play of light and shadow. It wasn't until I lowered my camera that I noticed how quickly darkness was falling, and how the shadows seemed to move independently of the setting sun. Inside the RV, I checked the weather forecast on my satellite phone, the last piece of technology still working reliably. My cell phone had lost service hours ago, and now the RV's electrical system was acting up. The lights flickered intermittently, and the heating system made strange gurgling sounds. I blamed it on the remote location and tried to focus on reviewing my photos. That's when I noticed something in the background of one of the sunset shots. A dark figure standing at the canyon's edge, where I was absolutely certain no one had been. The photo was crisp, the figure unmistakable, humanoid but wrong somehow, its proportions stretched and distorted as I zoomed in, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. The scratching sound returned, louder now, coming from directly above my head, and this time it was accompanied by something else. The distinct sound of footsteps on the RV's roof. The footsteps moved with deliberate slowness, each step sending vibrations through the RV's frame. I sat frozen, my finger still on the laptop's trackpad, the distorted figure on my screen seeming to mock my growing terror. The electrical system went haywire, lights flashing in a strobing rhythm that made my head spin. Through the chaos, I heard something that turned my blood to ice. A low, wet chuffing sound, like someone trying to scent the air. I killed all the lights, hoping darkness would provide some cover. My hands shook as I reached for the satellite phone, but the screen remained black, no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The footsteps above had stopped, and somehow that was worse than the movement. The silence stretched on, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then came a new sound. A slow, deliberate dragging along the side of the RAV, moving toward the door. The door handle rattled, and I bit back a scream. I'd locked it, of course, but in that moment, the thin barrier of metal and glass seemed horrifically inadequate. The rattling stopped, replaced by a sound I still hear in my nightmares, a low, gurgling growl that no known animal could produce. The temperature inside the RV plummeted, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The windows began to fog over, and in the condensation, dark shapes appeared, handprints sliding downward, far too large to be human. I retreated to the bedroom at the back of the ARV, grabbing my camera and a flashlight. The camera had night vision capabilities. If I was going to die here, I wanted to leave evidence of what happened. The growling outside grew louder, more impatient. Something sharp scraped across the windows, and I heard the distinct sound of glass beginning to crack. I wedged myself into the corner, camera raised, trying to steady my shaking hands. The scratching suddenly stopped, and for a moment I dared to hope whatever was out there had lost interest. Then came a new sound from the front of the RV, the distinct click of the door lock disengaging. I hadn't touched it, hadn't moved, but somehow the door was unlocking itself. The handle turned with agonizing slowness, and in the dim light filtering through the windshield, I watched in horror as the door began to open. What stepped through that door defied everything I knew about reality. In the camera's night vision display, I could see it clearly. A twisted amalgamation of features that seemed to shift and change with each movement. It stood upright like a human, but stretched too tall for the RV's interior. Its head bent at an impossible angle against the ceiling, its limbs bent in too many places, and what I had thought were hands were something else entirely. Long, segmented appendages, tipped with curved claws, that had left those perfect parallel marks in the RV's paint. The creature moved with a horrible fluidity, each motion unnaturally smooth as it folded itself through the RV's narrow corridor. The camera's display flickered and distorted whenever I tried to focus directly on its face. But in the stuttering images, I caught glimpses of too many eyes, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The air grew thick with a musty, organic smell. Like wet earth and rotting leaves, my lungs burned with each breath, and darkness crept at the edges of my vision. I knew I had to move, had to run, but my body wouldn't respond, locked in place by some primitive part of my brain that recognized this thing as an apex predator. The creature cocked its head, those countless eyes fixing on my position. Its mouth, if you could call it that, split open in a smile that wrapped too far around its head, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. A sound emerged from that nightmare grin, something that might have been trying to be human speech but came out as a series of clicks and wet, sliding noises. The flashlight beam caught something I hadn't noticed before. Symbols carved into the creature's skin, ancient patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the light. They looked remarkably similar to the petroglyphs I'd photographed earlier near the canyon rim, the ones I'd assumed were Native American in origin. Now I understood why the old man at the gas station had been so insistent that this part of the canyon was forbidden ground. This thing hadn't just appeared here. It had been here all along, waiting for fools like me who ignored the warnings. It raised one of those awful limbs, claws extending toward me with deliberate slowness. The camera's display went completely black, but not before I caught a final image. Behind the creature, more shapes were crowding through the RV's door, their forms even more impossible than the first. The temperature dropped so low that frost began forming on the windows, and that's when I realized the truth. These things weren't just visiting our world. The RV had somehow strayed into their territory, a forbidden space between realities. Under the weight of that revelation, something in my mind cracked, with a scream that didn't sound entirely human myself. I lunged forward, ducking under the reaching claws. I had one chance, and only one thought filled my mind. The emergency exit window in the bathroom behind me. The creature made a sound like breaking glass and tearing metal, and the whole RV shuddered as something much larger began forcing its way inside. I slammed the bathroom door and engaged the flimsy lock. Knowing it wouldn't hold for more than seconds, the emergency exit window was small. Too small, I feared. But it was my only option. Outside, I could hear more of those things arriving, their movements making the whole RV rock on its suspension. The bathroom door began to splinter, those awful claws piercing through the thin material like it was paper. I fumbled with the window's release mechanism, my hands slick with sweat. The window finally popped open, and I squeezed through just as the bathroom door exploded inward. Something grabbed at my leg, claws tearing through my jeans and into flesh. The pain was electric, but the adrenaline was stronger. I kicked out wildly and felt my foot connect with something that yielded like wet clay. The grip loosened just enough for me to pull free, tumbling onto the rocky ground outside. The night air hit my lungs like ice water, and the stars above wheeled sickeningly in my vision. I scrambled to my feet. Not daring to look back at what was emerging from the RV, the canyon's edge was only 30 feet away. Beyond it lay a sheer drop of over 2,000 feet. But as I took a step toward the only escape route that didn't involve going back past the RV, I saw something that stopped me cold. More shapes rising from the canyon's depths. Climbing the sheer walls with impossible grace, their forms were even more nightmarish than the first creature, some with too many limbs, others seeming to flow like liquid shadow. The air itself seemed to be changing, growing thicker, more viscous. The stars above began to fade, replaced by lights that moved in patterns that made my eyes water. Reality was thinning here, the boundary between worlds becoming permeable. From the Arv came sounds of rending metal and breaking glass. They were tearing it apart now, maybe searching for more prey, or maybe simply destroying it out of malevolent joy. I had only moments before they turned their full attention back to me. That's when I noticed something. The symbols I'd seen carved into the first creature's skin were also etched into the rocks around me, forming a rough circle. They glowed faintly with a sickly greenish light, pulsing in rhythm with the moving stars above. This wasn't just their hunting ground. It was a doorway, a deliberate weakening of the walls between worlds, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The realization came with a surge of nausea. How many other travelers had they lured here over the years? How many other Ravs and campers had fallen into their trap? A chorus of those awful clicking voices rose behind me, and I knew without looking that they were emerging en masse from the ruined RV. Ahead, the first of the climbing horrors reached the canyon's rim, its form coalescing into something that defied description. I was surrounded, trapped between two groups of nightmares. The symbols in the rock pulsed brighter, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to vibrate. The air rippled like heat waves, and through those ripples, I caught glimpses of another world, a place of twisted geometries and writhing shadows where these things called home. The choice before me was impossible: face the creatures or jump into the canyon's depths. But as the air continued to warp and reality buckled around me, I realized there might be a third option. The symbols carved into the rock weren't just marking this place. They were maintaining it, holding open whatever door these things were using. And the way they pulsed in sync with the creature's movements suggested a connection I might be able to exploit. My backpack still held the can of spray paint I'd brought to mark my photography locations. With shaking hands, I pulled it out, uncapped it, and began spraying over the nearest symbols, obliterating the careful lines and curves. The effect was immediate. The air shimmered violently, and the creatures emitted a collective shriek that made my ears bleed. The ones that had emerged from the RV stumbled, their forms becoming less stable, more fluid, encouraged by their reaction. I moved faster, defacing symbol after symbol. The world around me began to fracture, reality and unreality colliding in a kaleidoscope of broken physics. The creatures were losing cohesion now, their impossible anatomies fluctuating wildly as their anchor to our world weakened, but they weren't retreating. If anything, they became more frenzied, more desperate. One launched itself at me with frightening speed, its form elongating like stretched taffy. I dove and rolled, feeling claws graze my back. My hand found a rock, and I used it to smash the carved symbols I couldn't reach with the spray paint. Each destroyed marking sent shockwaves through the air, and the creature's movements became more erratic, more pained. But I knew I was running out of time. There were too many symbols, and too many monsters converging on my position. The ones from the canyon had reached level ground and were closing in, their bodies leaving trails of unreality in their wake. The paint can sputtered. Nearly empty, the rock in my hand was slick with blood from my torn palm. And still there were more symbols, more creatures. They had me surrounded in an ever-tightening circle, their forms rippling between states of matter, between dimensions. I could feel their hate, their hunger, their ancient intelligence focused entirely on my destruction. They had existed here for millennia, feeding on unwary travelers, and they weren't about to let their doorway be destroyed by one insignificant human. In that moment of despair, I saw something I'd missed before. A central symbol, larger than the others, carved into a flat rock at the center of the circle. It pulsed with a deeper light, and the other symbols seemed to orient themselves around it like spokes around a hub. I had one shot, 1 can's worth of paint left. And about 3 seconds before the creatures reached me, time seemed to slow as I raised the can, aimed and sent a stream of fluorescent orange paint toward that master symbol. The creatures lunged as one, but they were a fraction of a second too late. The world exploded. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Montrose. They told me I was found wandering along Highway 50, covered in blood, spray paint, and what they described as an unidentifiable black residue. My clothes were shredded, my body covered in cuts and scratches that refused to heal normally. The RV was never found, despite extensive searches of the area. The official report blamed mountain lions for my injuries and exposure for my apparent delusions, but I know what I saw. I know what lives in those canyon walls, waiting for the next fool to ignore the warnings. The symbols I destroyed that night will regrow. They always do, according to the old stories I've found since. The door will open again. The hunters will return. So let me be clear, stay away from Black Canyon. Don't go searching for the perfect campsite or the best photography spot. And if you're driving through at night and see strange lights or hear odd sounds, don't stop. Don't even slow down, because they're watching. Always watching. And they're hungry for more visitors to their little slice of hell between worlds. They're probably watching me even now as I write this. Sometimes I see their symbols appearing in the condensation on my windows, or catch glimpses of too many eyes in the shadows of my room. But I had to share this warning. Had to try to save others from my fate, remember? They don't just want to kill you. They want to show you what's on the other side of reality first. And trust me, you don't want to see that, ever. "20 years as a park ranger should have taught me better than to ignore weather warnings. But I'd spent so many winters among these ancient sequoias that I thought I knew every trick they could throw at me. The storm wasn't forecast to hit for another 2 days, plenty of time for one last solo trip in my RV before retirement. I'd seen snowstorms before. What I hadn't seen was how different these trees became when winter truly deepened, when the ancient darkness stirred beneath their bark. The snow started falling around noon, way ahead of schedule. My RV, reliable for a decade of backcountry excursions, picked that moment to sputter and die near one of the oldest sequoia groves in the park. The trees here were different from the usual tourist spots. Older, twisted into shapes that didn't quite make sense, even during my ranger days. We rarely patrolled this section. The radio was useless, filled with a low-frequency hum that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the swaying branches above. The first sign that something was wrong came when the snow started falling upward, just in patches at first. Flakes rising instead of falling, spiraling around certain trees in patterns too precise to be natural. The sequoias themselves seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of my eye, their massive trunks twisting in ways that would. Even ancient wood shouldn't move. The temperature dropped rapidly, but the tree's bark remained warm to the touch, pulsing like skin over a beating heart. Through the RV's windows, I watched the day darken far too quickly. The snow was falling heavily now, but only in a perfect circle around my vehicle. As if the storm was being directed by something with purpose, the ancient sequoias had begun to creak and groan, but not from the wind. There was no wind. The sounds were coming from inside the trees themselves, deep and rhythmic, like giant lungs breathing after centuries of sleep. Then I heard it. A sound no tree should make, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, vibrating through my RV's frame and into my bones. The sequoias were calling to each other, and in the gathering darkness, I could have sworn I saw the bark of the nearest tree split open like lips, revealing something that glowed like bioluminescent sap, but moved like it was alive. The darkness was absolute now, except for that awful glow seeping from the trees. My RV's electrical system was dead. but I could see perfectly by the light pulsing from within the sequoias. Their bark had become translucent, revealing complex networks of glowing vessels that should have been simple tree rings. Instead, they formed patterns that reminded me of neural networks, carrying signals from one ancient giant to another. My years of ranger training felt useless as I watched the snow continue to fall upward. Collecting in hovering clouds around the sequoia's upper branches, the trees were using it somehow, manipulating the frozen water to create barriers between their grove and the outside world. Through gaps in the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of the forest beyond. It looked wrong, shifted, as if this pocket of space was being pulled away from normal reality. The humming from underground grew stronger, and now carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. The trees were moving more openly now, their branches reaching and grasping with deliberate purpose. The nearest sequoia had bent its enormous trunk toward my arv. Its bark split open in multiple places, revealing what looked like eyes made of glowing sap. They were studying me, these ancient things that had masqueraded as simple trees for thousands of years. That's when my ranger training finally proved useful. I remembered the old surveys, the mysterious gaps in the forest's history. Every few decades, people would disappear in this grove. The official reports blamed winter storms, exposure, or animal attacks. But I'd seen the old photos, the strange patterns left in the snow, the unexplained organic matter found mixed with the tree rings. The sequoias weren't just ancient, they were hungry. Through my arv's frosted windows, I watched in horror as the snow clouds above the trees began to take shape, forming a dome that cut off all escape routes. The sequoias had done this before. They were creating a killing ground, a contained space where they could feed without revealing their true nature to the outside world, and I was trapped inside it. My RV now surrounded by massive trunks that pulsed with internal light and reached toward me with branches that moved like tentacles. The trees began to sing, not with voices but with resonances that traveled through wood and earth and metal, making my RV vibrate like a tuning fork. The sound carried images somehow, flashes of ancient memories from when these beings first took root. I saw them as seedlings, already aware, already hungry, spreading their network through soil and stone. They had been patient, so patient, slowly building their consciousness through root and fungus and shared nutrients. My arv's frame started to buckle as massive roots erupted from the ground beneath it. They weren't normal roots. They were translucent like the trees above, filled with that terrible glowing sap, and they moved with predatory purpose where they touched metal. It began to corrode and transform, becoming something organic and alive. The arv was being digested, broken down into components that the sequoias could absorb and understand through the disintegrating walls. I could see more clearly now how the trees were connected. Pulses of bioluminescence flowed through their root network in complex patterns, carrying signals faster than normal plants should be able to process. They were sharing information, coordinating their attack with an intelligence that had evolved over thousands of years. Each tree was both an individual hunter and part of a vast ancient mind. The snow dome above had become complete, trapping heat and light within its crystalline structure. The temperature inside rose rapidly as the sequoias began their digestion process. Their branches wove together overhead, forming a canopy that pulsed with that awful light. Smaller roots, thin as hairs but strong as steel cables, began probing through gaps in my arv's dissolving structure, reaching for me with horrible purpose. I had one advantage. 2 decades of studying these forests had taught me about fire. The sequoias had evolved to survive normal fires, but their new exposed biology might be more vulnerable. My emergency flares were still intact, their magnesium cores hot enough to burn through almost anything. But using them would mean exposing myself to those questing roots, those branches that reached like hungry fingers through my RV's decomposing shell. The roots had almost reached me when I struck the first flare. The magnesium flame caught one of the glowing tendrils, and the reaction was immediate and horrific. The root didn't just burn, it screamed, releasing a high-pitched tone that made my ears bleed. The sequoia it belonged to recoiled its entire trunk, its bioluminescent network flashing in patterns that might have been pain, might have been rage. The other trees responded instantly, their branches whipping through the air like angry serpents. The snow dome above began to contract, trying to smother any chance of fire spreading. But the burning root had revealed something crucial. These beings weren't just afraid of fire. They were vulnerable to it in their awakened state. Their transformed biology had sacrificed some of their natural defenses for the sake of consciousness and mobility. I struck more flares, creating a circle of magnesium fire around what remained of my Arv. The sequoias pulled back, their glowing vessels pulsing with rapid, chaotic patterns. The burning revealed more of their true nature. Beneath their bark wasn't wood, but something else. Something that looked like a cross between fungal growth and nervous tissue. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, the product of millennia of patient evolution. Through the flames, I could see the trees attempting to adapt, to solve this new threat to their feeding ground. Their shared consciousness was formidable, but it was also their weakness. What hurt one tree was felt by all. The magnesium fire was spreading through their root network, following paths of transformed tissue that burned far more readily than normal wood. Their ancient intelligence was working against them, carrying pain and panic through connections meant for sharing nutrients and information. The snow dome began to fracture as the trees lost their cohesion. Normal physics started reasserting itself as their influence weakened, but they weren't finished. Not yet. As their biological network burned, they released something into the air. Spores or seeds that glowed with the same light as their internal vessels. Each mote that touched my skin tried to burrow in, to plant something that would grow into a new form of their ancient consciousness. The spores were the sequoia's last defense, their way of preserving something of themselves even as their transformed bodies burned. Each one carried a fragment of their vast, shared memory, trying to force understanding even as it attempted to take root. Images flooded my mind, centuries of patient observation, of slow, careful feeding on lost travelers, of gradually building a neural network through root and fungus and shared consciousness. But human minds weren't meant to process memories that unfolded over thousands of years. The flood of ancient images began to fragment, to break down into chaos, as my brain rejected their attempt at transformation. Through the haze of invaded thoughts, I saw the burning magnesium spread through the entire grove. The sequoias were retreating, pulling back into themselves, trying to survive by returning to their dormant state. The snow dome collapsed completely, releasing a blast of frozen air that helped suppress the flames. As normal winter darkness returned, I watched the trees slowly freeze, their bioluminescent networks going dark, their transformed tissues reverting to normal wood. By dawn, they looked like ordinary sequoias again, ancient but inert. Only the strange burn patterns and the lingering glow deep within their rings suggested anything had happened at all. Park Rescue found me 2 days later, half frozen but alive. They blamed the destruction of my Arv on an electrical fire combined with storm damage. The official report mentioned nothing about the strange burn patterns in the sequoia's rings or the organic material found in the snow that didn't match any known species. The grove was quietly marked off limits, cited for environmental concerns, but I know what's sleeping in those ancient trees. Sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, I can still feel echoes of their memories trying to take root in my mind. I see flashes of centuries passing like days, of patient hunger slowly building consciousness through root and soil. The spores left something in me, some fragment of their vast alien awareness that will never quite go away. So here's my warning. Stay away from the old sequoia groves in winter. If you see snow falling upward or lights pulsing beneath ancient bark, run. Don't stop to take pictures, don't try to understand. Just drive as far and as fast as you can, because when winter deepens and darkness falls, the oldest trees wake up, and they are so very, very hungry. I should have listened to my daughter Emily's concerns about the lava tubes. She'd always been sensitive to things the rest of us couldn't perceive. But my wife Karen and I dismissed her anxiety as just another 12-year-old's fear of the dark. We'd spent months planning this Arv trip to Oregon's volcanic regions. and I wasn't about to let some baseless fears ruin our perfect camping spot. The old lava field offered an incredible view of Mount Hood, and the surrounding caves promised interesting exploration opportunities. Our Thor magnitude rather handled the rough terrain well, though the GPS kept glitching as we approached the ancient lava flows. We found a level spot near one of the larger cave entrances, surrounded by twisted basalt formations that seemed to catch and hold the late afternoon light. Emily refused to help with setup, staying inside the Arv and watching the cave entrance with unwavering attention. Karen tried to coax her out, but our daughter just kept repeating that something down there was awake and hungry. The problems started at sunset. First, our phones lost service, not unusual in remote areas. Then the RV's electrical system began acting strangely. The lights would brighten and dim in irregular patterns, and the heating system cycled on and off despite the moderate temperature. I blamed it on voltage fluctuations from our solar setup, but Karen noticed something odd. During each power surge, all our metal cookware vibrated slightly, as if responding to some powerful magnetic field. As darkness fell, we heard the first sounds from the cave, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to resonate with the RV's metal frame. Emily started crying, saying she could feel them moving closer, drawn to our presence. I tried to rationalize it as wind moving through the lava tubes, but even I couldn't explain the way our cutlery began arranging itself on the counter, all pieces pointing toward the cave entrance like compass needles finding magnetic north. The humming grew louder as we prepared for bed, and now carried harmonics that made our teeth ache. Through the Arv's windows, we could see faint lights dancing in the cave mouth. Not the steady beam of another camper's flashlight, but an organic pulsing that reminded me of deep-sea creatures. That's when Emily screamed that they were coming up, and the ground beneath our RV began to vibrate with unnatural warmth. The temperature inside the RV climbed rapidly despite the cool night air outside. Our weather station showed an external temperature of 45 degrees, but inside it was pushing 90 degrees and rising. The metal floor became too hot to touch, and a strange odor filled the air. Something metallic and organic at the same time, like blood mixed with molten iron. Emily had retreated to her bunk, wrapping herself in a wet towel and whispering about the hungry things that lived in the Earth's blood. Karen suggested we move the Arv, but when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The battery was dead. Though we'd had full power just hours before, outside the humming had changed pitch, becoming almost melodic. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising from the ground itself. Through the windows, we could see more lights emerging from the cave entrance, pulsing in sync with the humming. They moved with purpose, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The heat continued to build, and condensation began streaming down our windows. Condensation that moved against gravity and formed impossible shapes before evaporating. Our metal surfaces were now vibrating constantly, and small objects started moving on their own, sliding across counters toward the cave's direction. Emily screamed that they were tasting us, testing our composition. Through her tears, she described creatures that existed in a state between solid and liquid, between organic and mineral, ancient things that fed on heat and metal and the magnetic fields of the Earth itself. I tried to radio for help, but our emergency radio only picked up that awful humming, now overlaid with something that might have been voices speaking in frequencies that human ears were never meant to process. The temperature hit 100 degrees, then 110 degrees. The RV's metal walls began to creak and groan as if under immense pressure. Karen discovered that our aluminum cookware was starting to deform, the metal becoming soft despite not being near its melting point. The lights from the cave had reached our RV now, revealing themselves as floating orbs of plasma that left trails of magnetic distortion in their wake. Where they touched the RV's exterior, the metal seemed to ripple like water. Emily said they weren't lights at all. They were just the parts of the creatures that our eyes could safely perceive. The rest of their forms existed in spectrums of radiation and magnetism that would drive us mad if we could see them. As if to prove her point, one of the orbs passed through our wall like it was paper, bringing with it a wave of heat that made the air shimmer. The orb that entered our RV hovered in the center of the living area. Pulsing with colors that didn't exist in nature, Emily said it was just a probe, a tiny piece of the larger entities still emerging from the lava tubes. The air around it warped like a heat mirage, and every metal object in the RV began to strain toward it. Our wedding rings grew uncomfortably hot, and Karen's necklace tried to pull itself toward the light, leaving angry red marks on her neck before she could unclasp it. More orbs began phasing through our walls, each bringing with it new frequencies of that maddening humming. They moved with deliberate purpose, arranging themselves in geometric patterns that seemed to fold through additional dimensions. Emily was sobbing now, saying they were preparing us for extraction. Through her heightened senses, she could see the larger creatures rising from the depths, massive, fluid forms of living magma and electromagnetic energy that had evolved in the Earth's core and now saw our technology as an irresistible food source. The heat became unbearable as the orbs began to spin, creating a vortex of magnetic energy that made my vision blur. Our phones, tablets, and laptops crackled with electricity before their batteries burst, leaking fluid that moved on its own. Drawn into the growing magnetic storm, Karen tried to reach Emily's bunk, but the metal floor had become soft and sticky, trying to hold her feet in place. The air itself felt thick, charged with particles that sparked and danced in the otherworldly light. Through the windshield, we could see the cave entrance glowing with the same impossible colors as the orbs. Something massive was emerging, its true form hidden behind veils of heat distortion and magnetic interference. Where it touched the ground, rocks melted and reformed into twisted sculptures that hurt the mind to look at. Emily screamed that it was just a baby, one of countless ancient things awakening in volcanic regions across the world. Drawn to humanity's electromagnetic emissions like moths to a flame, the orb's spinning reached a fever pitch, and the RV structure began to buckle. Metal fixtures melted and flowed upward against gravity, forming patterns that matched the symbols now burning themselves into our walls. The creatures weren't just consuming our technology, they were rebuilding it according to their own impossible geometries, and we were caught in the middle of their reconstruction. The RV's transformation accelerated as more of the greater entity emerged from the cave. Our walls became permeable, solid matter turning fluid as fundamental forces were rewritten by the creature's presence. Emily's cries had turned to haunting whispers. She was translating their communications now, describing a civilization that had evolved in the planet's core, feeding off the Earth's magnetic field until our electrical age had drawn them closer to the surface. Our technology was irresistible to them, not just as food, but as raw material for their expansion. Karen managed to reach Emily's bunk, despite the liquefying floor, but I could only watch in horror as the ceiling began to spiral inward, forming a vortex of flowing metal that matched the orb's rotation. The temperature passed 120 degrees, and the air shimmered with metallic particles pulled from our dissolving vehicle. Through gaps in reality, I caught glimpses of the greater entity's true form, a massive, fractal geometry of magma and magnetic force that folded through space in ways that made my mind recoil. The humming reached frequencies that made our bones vibrate, and the orbs began to combine into larger formations. Emily translated their purpose through her tears. They were building a gateway, converting our RV's mass into a stable portal to their realm deep within the Earth. The transformed metal flowed like quicksilver, forming channels and conduits for energies that our physics couldn't explain. We were witnessing the birth of something that existed between states of matter, between dimensions of space. That's when Emily revealed our only chance. The creatures were powerful, but primitively single-minded, drawn irresistibly to electromagnetic fields. Our RV's backup generator was still intact, protected by its plastic housing. If we could reach it and overload its circuits, the sudden electromagnetic pulse might disrupt their manifestation long enough for us to escape. The risk was enormous. In their current state, the creatures might simply absorb the energy and grow stronger. The decision was made for us as the greater entity began pulling our transformed RV toward the cave entrance. Through the flowing walls, we could see more of its kind emerging, drawn by the gateway their servants were creating from our vehicle's remains. Emily's translations became more urgent. They weren't just coming for our RV anymore. They wanted to use us as conductors, living antennas to help them spread across the surface world. The generator was in an external compartment, but reaching it meant crossing the living room where reality had grown thin. The orbs were moving faster now, their patterns more complex as they wove our RV's matter into their gateway. Karen held Emily close as I made my way across what used to be our floor, each step sending ripples through metal that had forgotten it was supposed to be solid. The humming had become a physical force that pressed against my skull, trying to reshape my thoughts into patterns that matched their alien frequencies. I reached the generator compartment just as the greater entity began its final approach. Through the kaleidoscope of our dissolving walls, I could see it clearly now. A being of such geometric complexity that my mind created simplified abstractions to avoid breaking under the strain of its true form. It moved like flowing lava, but sparkled with magnetic fields visible to the naked eye. A creature evolved to exist in the incredible pressures and temperatures of Earth's core. The generator's plastic casing had protected its contents from transformation, but the metal within was straining toward the creature's influence. I knew I had only seconds before it too began to dissolve. Emily screamed a warning in their harmonic language. They had realized our plan. The orbs broke their pattern, rushing toward me with predatory purpose. The air turned to plasma around them, and I felt my fillings trying to tear themselves from my teeth. With trembling hands, I crossed the wires Emily had described, sending a massive surge through the generator's circuits. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world turned inside out. The electromagnetic pulse exploded outward, carrying harmonics that caused the orbs to vibrate at conflicting frequencies. They scattered like mercury dropped on a hot plate, their careful patterns dissolving into chaos. The gateway they'd been building collapsed, taking most of our RV's transformed mass with it. The greater entity recoiled, its magnetic fields disrupted by the pulse. The impossible geometries of its form began to unravel, forcing it to retreat toward the cave entrance. As its influence weakened, the laws of physics reasserted themselves. What remained of our RV solidified, though nothing would ever be quite normal again. The metal retained echoes of its transformation, forming patterns that shifted when viewed from different angles. We ran through the pre-dawn darkness, past rocks that still glowed with residual heat, past cave entrances that pulsed with magnetic heartbeats. Behind us, the humming changed to something that might have been screaming, might have been laughter. They weren't following us. They didn't need to. Emily translated their final message between gasping breaths. They were patient. They had evolved in the planet's core over millions of years. They could wait. We were found miles away by a park ranger, babbling about magnetic lights and living magma. They blamed our story on carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty generator. The remnants of our RV were never found, though magnetic anomalies in the area have increased. Strange lights are sometimes reported in the cave system, and compasses malfunction for miles around. So this is my warning. Stay away from the old lava fields near Mount Hood. If your GPS starts glitching or your phones lose signal, turn back. If you hear humming from the caves or see lights that move with purpose, run. And if you feel a strange warmth rising from below, if your metal objects begin to vibrate and strain toward the ground, don't wait. Don't think. Just drive, because they're still down there, growing stronger with each piece of technology they consume. And they're learning to reach farther from their caves, drawn by the siren song of our electromagnetic civilization. They're learning to hunt on the surface, and soon they'll be hungry again. The locals at Bar Harbor tried to warn us about Granite Point Island. The causeway floods completely during high tide, they said. No one goes there anymore, especially when the fog rolls in. But Lisa and I were drunk on newlywed adventure and the promise of having a beautiful main island all to ourselves. The old causeway looked solid enough at low tide, and our rental RV made it across without issue. We should have wondered why such a scenic spot had no other visitors. The island itself was small, maybe half a mile across, with a few abandoned summer homes and a crumbling lighthouse. We parked our RV on the highest point. Near the lighthouse, where we had a perfect view of the sunset over the Atlantic, Lisa was thrilled. It was exactly the kind of remote, romantic spot we'd hoped to find for our honeymoon. We watched the tide begin to rise, slowly submerging the causeway. We had checked the tide tables. We'd be stuck here until morning. But that was part of the adventure. The fog started rolling in just before dusk, unusually thick even for coastal Maine. It moved against the wind, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The lighthouse, though long defunct, began to emit a faint glow from its tower. Lisa, who'd been photographing the sunset, showed me something strange on her camera's display. Dark shapes moving in the fog, too large to be birds, too fluid to be drones. The longer we watched, the more the shapes seemed to be circling our position. That's when we first heard the singing. It came from the water, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with the lighthouse's mysterious glow. It wasn't quite whale song, wasn't quite human voice. It stirred something primitive in my brain. Memories of a time when humans were not the ocean's apex predators. Lisa grabbed my arm, pointing at the shoreline. The fog had pulled back just enough to reveal dozens of dark forms emerging from the waves. The RV's radio switched itself on, cycling through frequencies that produced only static and fragments of that awful singing. Through the windows, we could see the lighthouse's glow intensifying, pulsing in rhythm with the song. The shapes in the fog were moving closer, and now we could see they were leaving trails of bioluminescence in their wake. The tide wasn't just rising anymore, it was racing in, far faster than any natural tidal pattern should allow. The water reached the RV in minutes, not hours. Lisa checked her tide charts again and again, insisting this was impossible. We should have had hours before the high tide peaked, but the ocean wasn't obeying natural law anymore. The water was already halfway up our tires, and those singing shapes were getting closer. In the RV's headlights, we caught glimpses of them, forms that seemed to shift between fish and human, between solid matter and living fog. The radio's static took on new patterns, becoming almost comprehensible. Between bursts of white noise, we heard voices speaking in a language that sounded like a mixture of whale song and ancient Greek. The lighthouse's glow had become a strobing pattern that made my head hurt. When I looked at it directly, Lisa, who'd studied marine biology, was frantically searching through her research documents on her laptop. She found references to local legends about fog singers, creatures that the indigenous peoples said lived in the deep trenches offshore. Our RV's metal frame began to vibrate in response to the singing, and a thick greenish mist started seeping in through every seal and seam. It carried the smell of the deep ocean, not the clean salt scent of the surface, but the ancient organic smell of the abyssal plains where the mist touched metal. It left patterns of corrosion that moved and shifted like living things. The water outside was now up to our windows, but it wasn't behaving like water should. It moved in spiral patterns, forming whirlpools that spun in impossible directions. The shapes were close enough now to see clearly, though my mind refused to fully process what I was seeing. They had the general form of seals or dolphins, but their skin was translucent, showing internal structures that glowed with bioluminescence. Their faces were the worst part. Features that seemed to constantly shift between different species of marine life, occasionally settling into something disturbingly human. They weren't swimming so much as flowing through the water, their bodies merging with and separating from the fog at will. Lisa managed to get through to the Coast Guard on our satellite phone, but the only response we got was a burst of that otherworldly singing, followed by a voice speaking in what sounded like reversed Latin. The call log showed the connection had been made to a number that was just zeros, and the phone's screen was now displaying text in an alphabet that looked like a cross between ancient Greek and cephalopod chromatophore patterns. The creatures began some sort of ritual, circling our RV in complex patterns that made the water swirl and rise even higher. The lighthouse's glow synchronized with their movements, and we realized the building wasn't just a lighthouse. It was some kind of beacon or signal device. The fog singers hadn't just found us by chance. The island was their territory, and the lighthouse was their tool for luring in prey. Through the windows, Now completely submerged except for the top portion, we watched in horror as some of the creatures approached the lighthouse. Their bodies flowed through the stone walls like they were moving through water, and the building's glow intensified. The structure began to change, its solid granite flowing and reshaping itself like wet clay. The lighthouse was transforming into something organic, its walls developing patterns that reminded me of fish scales and whale bones. Lisa's laptop, still functioning despite the electromagnetic interference, displayed a final document before its screen went dark. A collection of local newspaper articles from the 1920s. They described a series of disappearances on the island, all on foggy nights during unusually high tides. The lighthouse keeper's final log entry, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described singing shapes that emerged from the fog and changed everything they touched. The log ended mid-sentence. The water pressure against the RV was becoming dangerous. Windows creaked under the strain, and seals were beginning to fail. The greenish mist had filled most of the interior now, and where it touched our skin, it left a tingling sensation and faint, luminescent patterns that slowly spread like growing coral. Lisa noticed it first. We were starting to see things that shouldn't be visible, picking up wavelengths of light that human eyes weren't designed to process. The creature's song reached a crescendo, and the lighthouse responded. Its transformed structure began emitting pulses of energy that we could now perceive as ripples in reality itself. They weren't just changing matter, they were altering the fundamental forces that held it together. The RV's metal frame started to soften and flow, trying to reform itself into shapes that belonged in the deep ocean. We were being transformed along with our vehicle, being prepared for a journey to somewhere far below the waves. The transformation accelerated as more of the creatures joined the circle. Our RV was no longer just a vehicle. It was becoming a hybrid thing, a blend of marine biology and altered physics. The windows had become translucent membranes that pulsed with bioluminescence, and the walls developed textures like whale skin. Through our changing eyes, we could see the true nature of our attackers. They were colonists from the deep, ancient things that had evolved in ocean trenches where the pressure and darkness created possibilities that surface science couldn't explain. Lisa's marine biology background helped her understand what was happening, though the knowledge only made it more terrifying. The creatures weren't just transforming us, they were adapting us for deep-sea survival. The patterns spreading across our skin were chromatophores, like those of octopi and squid. The tingling sensation was our nervous systems being redistributed, reformed to process sensory information that no surface dweller was meant to comprehend. We were becoming something new, something that could survive in their realm. The lighthouse had completely transformed now, its structure resembling a massive sea anemone made of stone and bioluminescent tissue. Its pulses took on a different rhythm, and we felt a pulling sensation, not physical, but something deeper, like our very atoms were being called to the ocean. Through the membrane windows, we saw other transformed vehicles half buried in the seafloor around the island. They had become reef-like structures, their metal and machinery grown over with the same hybrid biological mineral formations that were consuming our RV. That's when Lisa made a desperate discovery. The creatures were following a precise pattern in their ritual, timed to the lighthouse's pulses. If we could disrupt that timing, we might break their control. The RV's horn was still functional, though it now produced sounds more like whale song than a mechanical honk. Lisa had perfect pitch and recognized the key of their singing. If we could produce a counternote, create dissonance in their harmony, we had one chance. The transformation was almost complete, and soon we wouldn't be human enough to want to escape. The water pressure was immense, but the RV's new biology was adapting to it. Through the membranous windows, we could see the ocean floor dropping away. They were preparing to take us to their city in the deep. The horn was transforming too, its sound becoming more organic by the second. It was now or never. Lisa hit the horn at exactly the right moment, producing a note that clashed violently with the creature's song. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The harmony that held their transformative power together shattered, sending shockwaves through the water. The lighthouse thing convulsed, its bioluminescent patterns becoming erratic. The creatures scattered, their forms destabilizing as their ritual was disrupted. The RV's transformation began to reverse, but the process was violent. Metal and tissue fought for dominance as natural law reasserted itself. The pressure of the deep water became a threat again as our adaptations began to fail. Through the clearing fog, we could see the surface far above. Other transformed vehicles were rising too, their hybrid forms breaking down. We were surrounded by a cloud of dissolving biomass and disintegrating metal. The creatures made one final attempt to maintain their hold. They regrouped, trying to reform their circle, but their song had lost its power. The lighthouse collapsed in on itself, its impossible geometry failing as the forced fusion of organic and mineral fell apart. The water was filled with debris, pieces of boats, cars, and other vehicles they'd collected over decades, now freed from their transformed state. Our RV's engine roared back to life, more machine than marine now, and we felt ourselves rising. The pressure decreased as we ascended, and the pain was excruciating as our bodies returned to normal. The bioluminescent patterns on our skin faded, though they didn't disappear completely. Through the clearing water, we could see dawn breaking above. The creatures wouldn't follow us into the light. They needed darkness and pressure to maintain their power. We breached the surface as the sun rose, our RV mostly restored but forever changed. The causeway was accessible again. The tide having returned to its natural rhythm, we drove off the island at full speed, leaving behind a scene that no one would believe. The lighthouse was gone, collapsed into a pile of normal stone, and the waters around the island were littered with decades worth of transformed vehicles, slowly returning to their original state. The Coast Guard found us hours later, babbling about singing fog and living water. They blamed our story on carbon monoxide poisoning, said the lighthouse had been destroyed years ago, but they couldn't explain the bioluminescent patterns that still sometimes appear on our skin in dark water, or why our RV's horn occasionally produces sounds that make whales change course miles away. So here's my warning. Stay away from Maine's tidal islands, especially in the fog. If you hear singing that makes you think of the deep ocean, run. If you see lights that move against the tide or fog that flows with purpose, get to high ground. And if you find a lonely island with a lighthouse that glows when it shouldn't, don't stop, don't explore, just drive. Because they're still out there in the deep trenches and dark waters, and they're still singing, still calling, still hungry for new forms to add to their collection in the deep. "15 years of driving big rigs through the worst conditions imaginable hadn't prepared me for that lake. It didn't show up on any GPS, wasn't marked on any of my maps. But there it was, a perfect circle of black ice surrounded by pristine snow. My RV's engine died just as I spotted it, sputtering out with a finality that told me this wasn't a simple fix. The temperature gauge hadn't shown any warning, but steam poured from under the hood as if the engine had overheated in the -20 weather. The sun was already setting, though it was barely 3 p.m., typical for Alaska in winter. I'd chosen this remote route because I knew these roads, or thought I did. Every winter, I'd driven semis loaded with supplies to remote villages, but I'd never seen this lake before. The ice was oddly dark, almost metallic, and seemed to absorb what little sunlight remained instead of reflecting it. As I tried to radio for help, I noticed something else strange. The ice was completely smooth without a single crack or bubble, not natural, not possible. My radio picked up nothing but static, which shifted in pitch whenever I looked at the lake. The GPS kept trying to recalculate, showing my location jumping between points hundreds of miles apart. Even my phone's compass was spinning wildly. I'd dealt with equipment failures in the cold before, but this was different. Everything electronic was malfunctioning in the same way, as if something was disrupting the very laws that made them work. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness crept in, far faster than usual even for an Alaskan winter. My RV's thermometer showed -40, then -50, but the lake's surface remained glossy black, showing no signs of the extreme cold. No ice should look like that at these temperatures. As I watched through my windows, I noticed something else. There were no reflections on the lake's surface. Not from the remaining daylight, not from my RV's lights, not even from the first stars appearing above. That's when I heard it. A deep cracking sound, but wrong somehow. It didn't echo like ice breaking should. Instead, the sound seemed to curl in on itself, as if traveling through dimensions where acoustics work differently. And it was repeating, forming a pattern that reminded me of Morse code, or maybe something trying to imitate it. Through my front windshield, I watched in horror as the lake's surface began to shift, not breaking apart like normal ice, but moving like a single living entity. Night fell completely around 4 p.m., but the lake somehow became more visible in the darkness. It emitted a faint luminescence, a deep blue-black glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with that strange cracking sound. I'd turned off my RV's lights to conserve battery power, but I didn't need them anymore. The lake provided enough illumination to see clearly for 100 yards in every direction. The light it cast wasn't natural. Shadows fell in the wrong directions and sometimes moved independently of their sources. I tried to start the RV again, more out of desperation than hope. The engine turned over but made a sound no machine should make, a liquid organic gurgle that reminded me of the noises my kid's pet frog made when hunting crickets. I killed the ignition immediately. Through the floor, I could feel vibrations coming from the ground, or maybe from the lake itself. They traveled up through my feet and into my bones, carrying patterns that felt almost like language. The temperature kept dropping, but the lake's surface remained liquid smooth. The cracking sounds increased in frequency and complexity, and I realized with growing horror that they were responding to my movements. When I shifted in my seat, the pattern would change. When I touched the RV's metal frame, the sounds would intensify. It was studying me, learning my patterns just as I was trying to understand its own. Around midnight, the northern lights appeared, but they were wrong too. Instead of dancing across the whole sky, they concentrated directly above the lake, forming a spiral that slowly descended toward its surface. The lake's glow intensified in response, and the vibrations became strong enough to shake my RV. That's when I saw the first creatures emerging from the ice. Shapes that seemed to be made of living crystal, their geometries changing with each movement in ways that hurt to look at. They rose from the lake's surface like glass sculptures coming to life, their forms suggesting humanoid figures but twisted through extra dimensions. Light passed through them in impossible ways, splitting into colors that had no names in any human language. They moved with deliberate grace, leaving trails of freezing air that crystallized into fractal patterns before shattering into darkness. And they were coming toward my RV, their crystalline limbs clicking against the ice in perfect synchronization with those awful cracking sounds. The creatures surrounded my RV, their crystalline bodies resonating with tones that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Through their translucent forms, I could see what looked like frozen lightning, geometric patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid mathematics. They weren't examining my vehicle, they were solving it, reducing its structure to equations I couldn't comprehend where they touched the metal. Frost patterns spread in perfect fractals, each one containing symbols that seemed to move when viewed directly. The northern lights had descended so low now that they almost touched the lake's surface, forming a cylinder of shifting colors around the entire area. Inside this barrier, normal physics seemed to be breaking down. Water bottles froze into impossible shapes, their contents crystallizing in spirals that defied gravity. Metal surfaces developed patterns that moved and shifted like living things, forming and reforming into increasingly complex geometric arrangements. I tried to reason with them, shouting through my RV's walls, but my words froze in the air, forming crystals that the creatures collected and studied. They seemed fascinated by human speech, but not for its meaning. They were interested in its mathematical properties, the wave patterns it made in their crystalline atmosphere. They responded with sounds like breaking mirrors, each note carrying frequencies that resonated with different parts of my body. The lake's surface had become a massive fractal pattern now, a living Mandelbrot set that twisted through dimensions I could almost but not quite perceive. Through my distorted windows, I watched as other things began to emerge. Crystalline structures that might have been buildings, might have been vehicles, might have been frozen moments of time itself. They were creating something, transforming this pocket of reality into an environment that suited their geometric needs. That's when I realized what they were doing with my RV. They were solving it like a mathematical equation. Reducing it to its purest geometric form, the metal frame was already beginning to crystallize, transforming into something that followed their impossible physics. And I was part of the equation, my organic matter presenting a problem they were determined to resolve into perfect crystalline logic. The transformation accelerated as the northern lights touched the lake surface. My RV's structure began to fold through angles that shouldn't exist, its metal and plastic rewriting themselves according to the creature's crystalline mathematics. The windows weren't just freezing. They were becoming transparent barriers between different states of matter, showing me glimpses of geometries that existed outside of normal space-time. Through these dimensional windows, I saw other vehicles trapped in crystal, preserved like insects in amber. But they weren't just frozen. They were solving, slowly transforming into perfect geometric forms that served as components in some vast calculation. I recognized a school bus, its yellow frame twisted into a fractal spiral that hurt my eyes. Nearby, a pickup truck had become a recursive crystal structure that seemed to contain infinite copies of itself, each one solving a different part of the creature's grand equation. The creatures had begun some sort of resonating harmony, their crystalline bodies vibrating at frequencies that made reality itself shiver. The northern lights responded, forming patterns that matched their song in visual form. I realized they weren't just transforming matter. They were rebuilding the fundamental forces that governed this space, turning our messy organic reality into something that followed their rigid crystal logic. My own transformation had begun. Frost patterns spread across my skin, forming equations I could somehow read but not understand. My thoughts began to crystallize, each idea breaking into perfect geometric components that reflected and refracted through infinite recursive patterns. I was becoming part of their solution, my consciousness fragmenting into mathematical proofs that existed in more dimensions than human minds were meant to process. That's when I remembered something about crystals from my high school science class. They could be shattered by their resonant frequency. These beings were pure crystal, their entire reality based on perfect mathematical harmonies. If I could introduce enough chaos into their equations, create a discord in their perfect synchronization, the RV's horn was still working, powered by a simple electrical circuit they hadn't yet solved. It wasn't much, but it was the only organic randomness I had left. I slammed my hand on the horn, holding it down as long as I could. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but its chaotic frequencies sent ripples through the creature's crystalline forms. Their perfect geometries wavered as the horn's crude acoustic patterns introduced unsolvable variables into their equations. The northern lights flickered, their patterns disrupted by this intrusion of organic randomness. The creatures tried to adapt, their bodies restructuring to account for this new input. But the horn's sound kept changing slightly with each pulse. Never settling into a pattern they could solve, cracks began appearing in their crystalline forms. Not clean breaks along geometric lines, but chaotic fractures that defied their mathematical logic. The lake's surface shuddered, its perfect black ice showing hints of normal frozen water beneath. The transformation of my RV began to reverse as their influence weakened. Metal groaned and popped as it returned to its original form. Following the laws of normal physics rather than crystal logic, the frost patterns on my skin receded, taking with them the burning clarity of geometric thought and leaving behind a throbbing headache and a bone-deep cold that felt wonderfully, perfectly organic. The creatures were breaking down now, their perfect forms unable to maintain coherence in the face of chaos. They tried one final solution, attempting to merge into a single massive crystalline structure, but the damage was done, with a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering simultaneously. They collapsed, their geometric essence scattering across the lake's surface like diamond dust. The northern lights snapped back into the sky, resuming their natural dance. The lake's surface cracked, normally this time, with the random patterns of regular ice. By dawn, it looked like any other frozen lake in Alaska, its perfect blackness replaced by the dull white of normal ice and snow. My RV started on the first try, its engine running with the pleasant imperfection of ordinary machinery. The GPS still showed nothing but empty wilderness here, but now I understood why. Some things couldn't be mapped, couldn't be solved, needed to remain undefined. I've been back on the regular trucking route since then, staying away from unmarked lakes and roads that don't appear on maps. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, my rearview mirrors show frost patterns that form perfect geometric sequences, and my radio picks up sounds like breaking crystal trying to form words. The creatures are still out there, still trying to solve our chaotic world into their perfect crystal logic. So here's my warning. If you're driving in Alaska and find a lake that's too perfect, too black, too still, drive on. If your GPS starts showing impossible locations and your compass spins in geometric patterns, turn back. And if you see northern lights that spiral down instead of dancing across the sky, run. Run before they start solving you into something eternally, perfectly crystalline, because out there in the endless Alaskan night, there are things that want to make our messy, organic world mathematically perfect, and their solutions are forever.